Okay, so I'm Paul Dowling, and I'm going to start this off. My name's Paul Dowling. I'm a retired housing consultant and a member of Beach United Church. So as you all know, there's a affordable housing crisis in Toronto and in the rest of Canada. So the dream of owning their own home is now out of reach for many young people. And the high cost of renting an apartment or a house forces many people to turn to food banks. For many, the money that they receive from minimum wage jobs or social assistance is not enough to even rent a small room in the city's shrinking stock of rooming houses. While the government is announcing new programs and initiatives to stimulate the supply of housing, little of that new housing will be truly affordable, and almost none of it will meet the needs of the lowest income people in our country. Those whose income is inadequate for the housing market, government funding does provide some housing with subsidies. Put the first slide up there, James. In Toronto, the subsidized housing now has a waiting list of more than 105,000 households. So far this year, fewer than 1,400 people who are on that waiting list have been able to move into subsidized housing. And at the same time, 11,000 new households have joined the list. An increasing number of people in the city are finding themselves without a home. Let's see the next slide, James. On any given night, about 9,000 people sleep in city-funded shelters, including the hotels and motels, as well as purpose-built shelters operated by nonprofit organizations or by the city. The shelters are usually close to 99% full every night. And as well, every night, 100 people or more call the city's central intake line looking for a bed, but the city is unable to meet their need. All of us know that the real solution to homelessness is permanent, affordable, and supportive housing. We need to continue to call on our governments to make this much needed housing available. In the context of the continuing housing crisis, City Council has approved the development of thousands of units of new affordable housing and supportive housing. But the development of this much needed housing will take time. In the meantime, the city has committed to developing an additional 20 new shelters by 2023 in various locations across the city. So as you can see on this map, the existing shelters are scattered over the city. And the plan is to develop shelters in many other locations wider than that. In the east end of the city where I live, the city recently announced their plan to develop a new shelter on Gerrard Street, east of Victoria Park Avenue. I first heard about the proposed shelter in our local community newspaper, the Beach Metro News. The local councillor for the area echoed concerns that had been raised by some local residents about the shelter being located in their community in close proximity to a daycare center. He said, "I have a toddler. My thinking would have been different before I had a child. It's remarkable how your worldview changes after you have kids." I'm now mostly retired after a lifetime of work in the affordable housing and homelessness sector. In my work, I have often heard from various communities that objected to the introduction of those people into our community. I spent a good part of my working life responding to those people and their desire to exclude people because they are not like us, and they fear the impact of these different people will have in their community. The churches in my community have long been committed to meeting the needs of poor people in the otherwise affluent beach community. For many years, St. Aidan's Anglican Church, welcome Michael Van Dusen is here from St. Aidan's. So St. Aidan's Anglican Church hosted the Out of the Cold program, while with the support of other churches in the beach, like mine, Beach United Church. As well, for many years, the 5 faith communities that make up the Beach's Interfaith Outreach Lunch program have offered a meal to the community 5 days every week. Through these efforts, we get to know the poor people of our community. Many of the guests in the Interfaith Lunch have a home and visit our lunch program regularly because their income has all been consumed to provide for their housing. And a small number of those who come for lunch do not have a home, and a few of them we know even sleep in the park. These people who are homeless are part of our community, both part of the beach community and part of the wider Toronto community. We make them welcome in our churches, and we believe they should be welcome in our wider community. So based on many years of developing and operating shelters, the city knows that the location of a new shelter will always lead to some pushback in the local neighborhood. Concerns will be raised about the impact of the shelter on property values, community safety, or simply the introduction of those people into our community. Experience has shown that many of these calamities do not happen, and that once the shelter is established, it becomes invisible. Still, neighbors do their worst to prevent them from being located nearby. Historically, the city's planning process required that staff host a public meeting when a new shelter was proposed. Neighbors were able to attend to oppose the location of the shelter in their community, and city councilors were able to stop a shelter if they felt their constituents were opposed. In 2017, City Council established a new process for selecting locations for shelters. When the city identifies the need for a new shelter and the budget is approved for it, city staff are responsible to approve the specific location using selection criteria set out in the process approved by council. The local councillor is not required to approve the location. City staff are still expected to engage with the community to build support for the success of the shelter. The local community members do not have the power to approve or disapprove of the specific location. The city hires skilled facilitators to carry out a community engagement process, to reach out to established community organizations and faith communities for ideas about how to ensure the success of the new shelter. They engage the community using a variety of effective engagement techniques, including open houses, focus groups, and community liaison committees. The old show and shout public meetings are not seen as a helpful way of community engagement. You may have heard recently that a local community association in South Etobicoke is suing the city and the local councillor because the city did not give them an opportunity to object to the location of the planned shelter. The city is simply following the process that's established by city council. So when we heard about the new shelter that was planned on Gerrard Street near our community, folks from my church decided to attend a community meeting organized by the city and their facilitator. While the shelter is not in our immediate community, we felt that it could be a helpful resource for the people that we know that are without a home, as well as others in the wider community. The community engagement facilitator invited a small number of community representatives to speak in order to supplement the city's presentation at the community meeting. As expected, 2 local community representatives talked about their fears for the safety of their community. They suggested that the site chosen by city staff was not appropriate because of its proximity to a childcare center. City staff described the process that they had followed to select the site, and they said that since shelters are a residential use, it is not at all uncommon for them to be located where schools and childcare centers are also located. The other community representatives included Reverend Andrew MacDonald from the nearby St. Nicholas Anglican Church. Reverend MacDonald identified himself as part of the local community and a supporter of the new shelter as a much-needed community resource. I represented the Beaches Interfaith Outreach Lunch and spoke about the need for more shelters to respond to the needs of homeless people, the homeless people that we know in the community. These are members of our community. In response, the councillor denounced us as holier than thou and said that 4 shelters have been located in his ward, Southwest Etobicoke, while the Beaches East York ward has only 1. He said, a lot of folks in Scarborough feel like the city is dumping on Scarborough again. So in their zeal to oppose the shelter in their community, residents sometimes feel it is appropriate to characterize the shelter and the people that will stay in the shelter in very negative ways, like the city is dumping on us again. While some of the concerns that are voiced about the shelter might seem reasonable at first, they can also be seen as the discriminatory and exclusionary sentiments that they are. When you hear one of these reasonable concerns, I encourage you to substitute the name of another group that has historically faced discrimination. I would speak to my Irish ancestry and say, so when you hear them say, I don't have anything against homeless people, I just think there are better places for them to be placed. You could hear instead, I don't have anything against Irish people, I just think there are better places for them to be placed. If they say, we need to get the community involved early, they're the ones who know the best place for homeless people to go. You might hear, we need to get the community involved early. They're the ones who know the best place for the Irish people to go. The fact is that we don't have a right to decide who can be in the communities in which we live. Instead, we have a responsibility to welcome everyone in the community and to make their arrival and their stay as positive as it is for the rest of us. So when a shelter or a supportive housing is coming to your community and people are given a chance to speak about it, be a supporter. We know there will always be opponents. We need to be supporters. Support city staff, they have a very difficult job. Support the city councilor to do the right thing. And support the community engagement facilitator. And most importantly, support the person that is homeless. Jesus called us to welcome the stranger. Let's take the opportunity to do that. Stephen.
Thank you, Paul. That was great and a perfect setup for what I'm going to talk about. So my name is Reverend Stephen Milton, and I'm the lead minister at Lawrence Park Community Church, which is a United Church of Canada church that's located basically across the street from Sunnybrook Hospital, so Lawrence and Bayview in North Toronto. And what I want to talk about today is the story of how our church and a group of 7 other churches got involved with supporting a hotel shelter that was opened during the pandemic in our neighborhood. So in the summer of 2020, the city was forced to open many new shelters in a hurry due to the health risks of COVID-19. And 3 shelters were suddenly opened in the Yonge and Eglinton area. And if we can go to the map, Paul. Yeah, just the next slide. There we go. So this is the Yonge and Eglinton area. Yonge is the major north-south street in the middle of the map. The yellow dots present where the shelters were. There were 2 small ones on Broadway Avenue that just lasted a couple of months. And then there was a bigger one, the big yellow dot, at Roehampton and Mount Pleasant. And that's just a short sort of half block north of Eglinton Avenue east. And all 3 of these shelters were a surprise. There had been no public consultation. They just opened. And this caught even the local city councilors by surprise. The local public was not happy. Of the 3 shelters, the ones on Broadway closed quite quickly, but the Roehampton one stayed open. The Roehampton shelter was located inside the old Roehampton Hotel. You go to the next slide. There we go. And it had been closed so that it could be redeveloped as a condo site. But due to the pandemic, the city got a lease on the hotel and turned it into a shelter. It's next to a daycare on one side, so sort of where this picture is being taken, if you could look to the right, you would see a daycare. And then behind you across the street, kitty corner to the hotel, there's a high school. So just as Paul said, shelters are often located in residential areas near schools. Soon after the shelters opened, the neighbors started to complain that needles were being found in the daycare yard, as well as on school grounds and in the local alleyways. They weren't wrong. This was happening. And on August 15th, 2020, there was a major protest. We can go to the next slide, Paul. So there's a major protest. People in support and against the shelter turned out in good numbers, more people on the against side. This is taken from the perspective of those who are against. They lined up on both sides of Mount Pleasant, basically yelling at each other and chanting at each other. And both supporters and detractors were demonstrating in front of the hotel. And the detractors were really upset, and their signs really told the story. We could go a couple slides ahead, Paul. Yeah, there we go. So if you just read these signs, you get a sense of what it was about. They really felt that, they were saying, well, we care for the homeless, but not here. We don't want any crime here, and we certainly don't want the homeless anywhere close to our schools and our children. And we want safety over fear, as one of those signs explains. So I had been involved, and there's the hotel in the background, and those are the protesters who were in favor of the hotel. One sign says, "Love thy neighbor, you heartless ghouls." It got pretty colorful. I'd been interested in homelessness and poverty issues for a long time, having volunteered at a church soup kitchen for over a decade in the West End. And I was actually new to ministry in 2020. I just started in 2019, and I thought our church should try to help help the people who were the residents of this shelter. So I called around to find out what we could do. And I was informed that it was standard practice for shelters to have a community liaison committee. This is something that Paul just mentioned. And this committee is composed of shelter administrators who meet monthly with members of the public. And the members of the public have to be representatives of some sort. So our committee was composed of a few ministers like myself, as well as the head of some condo boards, the members of the local BIA, the school board trustee, and a bunch of politicians. So local representatives of community organizations who are invited to meet with the shelter administrators once a month to find out what's happening in the shelter. And for the shelter to, of course, hear what the community thinks of the shelter and what's going on. So I highly recommend, if you get a shelter in your neighborhood, sign up to be on the CLC. This is going to be your easiest way to know what's going on and to help. The first meeting that was held, which I think was either in September or October of 2020, was quite tense. The city had hired a mediator to chair the meeting, and there were local condo boards who were nervous and angry. There was a man who represented a local Facebook group, which had been created for the purpose of protesting the shelter, and it billed itself, I think the name was the Community Safety Group. And local politicians showed up, as did the local school trustee. That would be the last time we would see the politicians or the school trustee. They showed up for the first meeting to say that they were there, and then after that they disappeared. And in subsequent meetings for a couple of months, the politicians' staffers showed up, and then they disappeared too. So if our experience is any indication, these liaison committee meetings really become neighborhood meetings, and you don't have to worry about it becoming all highfalutin with politicians around. They don't have time for this kind of thing. So the meeting was very useful. The members of the community expressed their concern about the real problem of used needles being dropped into places where children could find them. They were also concerned about the perceived rise in thefts, shoplifting mostly, and most people didn't understand much about the causes of homelessness, but they were hyper aware and worried about how the shelter's presence might affect local safety and property values. The shelter administrators, to their credit, were extremely patient and flexible. I guess they'd been around this track before. They heard the complaints about the danger of needles in schoolyards, and they did something about it. They hired city workers who every morning went out, you see them in those yellow safety jackets, and they would just go around to the schoolyards and the daycare center and so forth and just pick up needles that had been left there overnight. So when the kids got to school, there were no needles to be found. And they did the same thing for the alleyways. The shelter also spoke to their residents to encourage them to be better neighbors, to be considerate, not leave their needles and paraphernalia around. And since this was COVID times, there wasn't much turnover in the shelter. Like, some people were going to be there for months and months and months. So they really were staying in the neighborhood when they were here. Shortly after the meetings began, I set up a monthly meeting the next day with 7 neighborhood churches. I knew these churches from before, since they were members of the North Toronto cluster, which in the United Church, we got rid of our presbyteries and we kind of streamlined our governmental system, but it meant that local churches had no organizations. So we created one we're encouraged to create these things called clusters. And clusters meet once a month. It's like the church board, whoever's the church council chair, as well as the minister, meets with their counterparts from other churches. So we have one of those, and there's about 8 churches on it. And they're the United Churches, which lie along Yonge Street on either side from basically Rosedale to the 401. So that's the North Toronto cluster. I knew some of the chairs of those churches from those meetings. So I said, hey, I'm going to these CLC meetings. Perhaps you'd like to know what's going on. And so that became what we call the Roehampton Friendlies Committee, named after the hotel itself. So we started meeting every month, and I would just bring them up to date on what happened the day before, what we'd heard from the shelter administrators, and then we try and figure out what we could do to help. And this help took two different forms, basically. The first was raising awareness of what was really happening at the shelter and how homelessness works. This work started within our group, but also spread to our congregations as we shared what we had learned. The awareness made it into sermons and updates to our congregations. And over the years, because this lasted for years, it also included online education sessions at night about things like safe consumption sites and poverty issues. And those would be organized by this group, the Roehampton Friendlies. The second form of help was more practical. Early on in the process, one of the shelter administrators said that there was actually a problem they were encountering when shelter residents transitioned into housing. So, that is the goal of shelters, right? Shelters are supposed to be short-term accommodations so people can get from the street to the shelter and then into housing. And one of the ways they get into housing is through government subsidies like COB, the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. The problem that shelter residents were facing, even once they got COB and even once they got a new apartment, they'd walk into the apartment with all of their belongings, which usually consisted of 2 bags. So they didn't have pots and pans, they didn't have dishes, they didn't have sheets for the beds. They didn't have any of the normal kind of stuff that you need to live in an apartment. So we decided to start creating welcome baskets for the shelter residents. And the shelter liked that idea, so we started doing these things. And if we could show a picture of that, Paul, it should be the next one in the deck. So this is a picture of what the shelter baskets look like. It's basically a laundry basket just packed with household goods with a blanket on top. And it's funny, this is from early on in the pandemic. If you see these welcome baskets now, they're half again as high. Our team's gotten quite good at packing them with tons of stuff. But they have, like forks and knives and pots and pans and everything you would need to basically start an apartment. And they do cost money. Our group, we were making about 15 of them a month at first, and our churches would take turns. So, my church would do it in September, another church would do it in October. And because we had 7 or 8 churches involved, that meant that we covered a lot of the year. It was interesting. We started by doing 15 of these, and they cost between, $100 to $400 each, depending on how much free stuff you can get from your congregation. The first batch you do, you'll get a lot of free stuff, and then after that, people have given what they've got. So this lady, Laura Lane, became an expert at going to Value Village on seniors' days to get, serious discounts on pots and pans and stuff. So the baskets, it was interesting. What happened with the baskets was we started by doing 15 a month. And then as the Ontario government cut back on COB, the shelter said, oh, we just don't have enough funding for people to move out of the shelter into into subsidized housing. So we went from 15 to 10 and then eventually to 5 for a while. And now we're back up to 10. So those things were a very practical, useful way of doing things. And another church, a church from the neighborhood, a Lutheran church, Christian Reformed, joined our committee because they'd heard about the baskets and they lived nearby. So they'd been part of our group as well. The Roehampton shelter was open during the pandemic, which meant that we couldn't get inside the shelter to meet with the residents. That just wasn't allowed. We went on a couple of minor tours of the first and third floor, but we couldn't actually talk to the residents. But we were able to cooperate with community groups to do things which could help the residents anyway. So this is a picture of the planters that a community group and our group raised money for, so that there could be plants which the residents could take care of, and they could plant herbs and stuff during the summer because there was a nice sort of patio deck on the 3rd floor, which people could use. At Easter time, we sent gift baskets like this, gift bags with nice cards in them saying you are loved, you're appreciated, with chocolates and stuff inside. so that people could at least know that there were churches outside who were trying to help and who were thinking of them. We also sent art supplies to people so that they could have a creative outlet. They're just trying to think of, okay, residents locked in a shelter during COVID, what might they want to do? Well, art maybe. So we sent art supplies to them. But perhaps the most important part of this journey was the way the CLC committee's monthly meetings changed the perception of the shelter. At first, many of the local resident organizations were very suspicious and hostile. They hadn't been asked about this shelter. It just was sprung on them. And all this happened during COVID. So everybody's spidey sense was tingling, and this seemed to be even worse. But what was interesting was that month after month, as we heard what was going on in the shelter, the community members were exposed to the hard realities of how homelessness in Toronto actually works. They learned more about drug addiction and the terrible effects of homelessness on the health of shelter residents. They learned why ambulance arrived almost every day due to the poor health of the residents, whether they had substance issues or not. They heard about homeless people who had chosen to have palliative care at the shelter because they didn't feel safe anywhere else. And over time, the community reps came to understand that the city was not trying to ruin the neighborhood, but to help a vulnerable population whose troubles were not primarily caused by their personal histories or failings, but by a system that doesn't work to provide enough affordable housing. Even the Facebook group representative mellowed, which came as a surprise to everyone, including himself. By the end of it, he was saying, okay, we get it. It's not all their fault. There's bigger issues here. As the pandemic wound down, the lease of the hotel came up, and the owner did not want to renew. So in August of 2023, the shelter closed. And tragically, I hear it's still empty. The condo redevelopment that was supposed to happen hasn't occurred. So in theory, we could have still had a shelter there, but that didn't happen. In terms of our church experience, this had several effects. First, we were helpful to the shelter. We often were able to make connections that the shelter administrators needed with people in the neighborhood. The welcome baskets were definitely useful. And we raised consciousness in the neighborhood about the need to house people who were poor, even in a rich neighborhood. And it became clear that a number of the residents were people who had actually grown up in that neighborhood. They weren't strangers to the neighborhood at all. They had grown up there, and this was just like coming home for them. I was definitely criticized online for some of my statements in support of the shelter. One should not expect consensus on this. And, it's really hard to tease out, all the factors which led to the hostility. I mean, the shelter on itself was a lightning rod, but this was also happening at the same time as a bunch of condo developments were going up, and the Eglinton LRT was delayed and delayed and delayed. So people were pretty cross anyway, and that often got focused on the shelter. But overall, I think that we helped create a bridge between the community and the shelter, which was useful and necessary and had all sorts of wonderful benefits for our church members, as well as the residents of the shelter. And I can talk about this later perhaps, but our group decided not to disband when the shelter closed. And we continue to do things. And I can talk about that later. So that's the story of our involvement with the Roehampton shelter.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. So I will now speak about another example. My name is Jamie Perttula. I'm a member and former warden of Church of the Resurrection in the East End of Toronto. This experience, I think you'll hear a lot of things that Paul and Stephen have already talked about. It's a slightly different situation because this is not about a shelter, but a story about a program that the City of Toronto has been running to provide supportive housing for people, homes for people who have been experiencing homelessness. But first, to start, the Church of the Resurrection is a neighborhood church in the East End of Toronto, Woodbine and Danforth area. I have been with my family attending there for more than 20 years. And I would say that the vast majority of the people live in the neighborhood, and so regularly see people in the congregation just wandering, doing their shopping along the Danforth and that. So it's got a very community-based feeling to it, and certainly a desire to be a positive presence in the neighborhood, and to have a relationship with our neighbors, and to in some way bless the neighbors. There's also within the congregation a strong heart for issues related to poverty and justice. We've worked with refugees in various ways, sponsoring refugees, but continuing to work with a refugee organization, support organization. We have several members of our congregation who are involved with or work directly for a number of ministries in the city that work to support people experiencing homelessness or involved in the street. And so this is a part of our ethos in many ways. One of the other things, and Paul touched on this a little bit, he noted the relationship among churches in the area, and certainly the Beach United has relationships with several churches in that immediate area, but Church of the Resurrection has engaged with those churches and others in a number of different ways to broaden our ministry, or to share ministry in various ways. Paul talked about, I can't remember if this was in his presentation or our pre-talk. We've worked with other churches to try to establish a forum for positive and value-based discussions during elections, and how we can engage in elections as people of faith. What does it mean for us to think about how our faith shapes how we vote and how we engage with the community and with our local leaders? We are called in Scripture to care for the poor and the widow, the orphan, and the strangers. And that's, I think, a big part of how the Church of the Resurrection has been thinking. What are the things that we need to do to live out as the hands and feet of Jesus in this particular place where we have been placed? In my non-church role, I work for the city planning division for the City of Toronto, and so I have an inside view of a number of things that happen. The City of Toronto a few years back started this, what was called a modular housing initiative, or rapid housing initiative. The idea was to build small apartment blocks with very simple modular bachelor kind of apartments for people who have been experiencing homelessness. Through my connections with friends and colleagues at work, I saw what went on as the first of these projects started to be introduced, and the things that Paul and Stephen talked about were the things that we were hearing: concerns around introducing pedophiles or drug users into areas, concerns about the crime rate and property values. What will this do? And that really hurt. I felt a real pain about that, actually. And then when I learned that one of the next projects was going to be in just up the street from our church, so I guess technically within our parish boundaries, I felt this strong call that somehow needed to do something about it. I wasn't sure what that something was, but I wanted to in some way be supportive. I saw the local councillor, who I know, taking some heat, some real heat, and I knew too that he was a strong advocate for this. Unlike some of the other examples that we've talked about, our councillor was behind this project, but he was facing a lot of pressure from the community. And so I was also concerned about what can I do to support and provide encouragement to him and to those who who were trying to establish this this development up the street from our church. This is an example of what it looks like. It's really quite a beautiful facility that they created here. I had a conversation with our pastor, the Reverend Julie Byrne, about this sense that I had that somehow I needed to do something, or maybe we as a congregation should be doing something to respond to this development being planned in our community. And so she invited me to present this to the congregation. All I did was simply tell them a bit about what was going on in the community and the project that was being developed, some of what was happening in terms of opposition more generally to these projects. I didn't present a plan to the congregation. I simply shared this and a little bit of the what was on my heart about how could we respond? How could I respond? How could we respond? How could we be a welcoming community for the eventual residents of this housing development? And I was really quite blown away by the response of people in the congregation. I felt like there was something stirred up. So Spirit of God stirring us up to somehow respond. And many people came up with different ideas about what could we do. There were a lot of ideas that were generated, but this really caught on in the church. There were a number of different ways that we were involved at early stages. So the first and I think one of the most important was a number of people committed to attending public meetings to express support for the establishment of this modular housing project. Voices of support are in the minority often at public meetings. And as an insider at City Hall, I understand how much the public voice influences what councillors do or how they feel constrained. And where they're only hearing negative concerns, it's harder for them to stand up and say that they support something. And they do, many do, but there's pressure on them where they have people also standing up and saying this is a good thing and we support it. They have people they can point to in the community to show that there's more than one voice. The other thing that I did because of my connection with the councillor, I was able to get our pastor, Julie Byrne, appointed to the Community Advisory Committee. This is similar to what Stephen talked about, but this was a committee started by the councillor as we were going through the whole planning and development process for this housing project. And Julie was able to play, I think, a really important role on the committee. She was one of the members of our congregation talked about being a non-anxious presence. We still need to be able to listen and relate to our neighbors, even if we don't necessarily agree. But that was a big part of what Julie was able to bring to that committee as the planning was going on and as they were talking about what would be the eventual supportive housing project. She did express to me at times how discouraged she was by some of what she heard. I think it was a real eye-opener for her in hearing what some neighbors were saying. The other thing we did was to offer help to the councillor. Not anything specific, but just to say if there are any ways that we, as a neighborhood church, can provide support for this project, we want to hear about it. As the project was going along and we were getting closer to the time that it would open, further ideas started to emerge about things that we could do. And then in conversations with the councillor's office, we came up with the idea of these welcome baskets, very similar to what Stephen's congregation and other congregations did. And that became a real point for the congregation to rally together, thinking of different ways that we could fill those baskets. And this is where our relationship with other churches in the area became important. And we were able to really build on the relationships that we'd established with the Mennonite church down the street, and the two Mennonite churches in the area, and the Baptist church up the street, and the United Church, and as well as a local Rotary Club. And one of our congregation members stirred up her neighborhood to contribute it as well. So we had a number of people participating in creating these welcome baskets, much like Stephen talked about, for the first residents of the building. And the picture you see on the screen is the baskets displayed at the opening of the facility. That was a real. I mean, it was a way for people in very practical ways to get involved. But also I was really excited to see how it also built on some of the things that we've been doing with other churches in the area and became another practical expression of our shared ministry and concern for the community. I wanted to draw out some lessons, and when I was preparing this, I was thinking about lessons that I would draw
They
from
do this all the time. I have no idea what.
Who's not muted?
So I was drawing on lessons from my experience, but I think some of these probably apply equally or more generically to the things that Paul and Stephen also talked about. I think, there are many different ways that we as congregations can find to be engaged with the community and with local counselors and positive opportunities. I think it's really important for us to be looking at how do we build a positive reputation, or that we are engaged in the community, not just when there's an issue of some kind of community controversy or the locating of a shelter, but trying to build a connection with the community, I think, is really important, and that positive engagement. The other thing that I would draw from this is the value in encouraging our local political leaders. I've said counselors here, but equally important for us to try to encourage our provincial representatives and our federal representatives. A good friend of mine frequently makes presentations or deputations to committees of council, and Joy is brilliant. I see many people present to council, and some berate council for the things they're doing, and some really aren't able to get much attention from councillors. Joy always goes in and talks about the positive things that council is considering doing, and really encourages them to be their better selves. And I also, with the authority, she speaks with some authority because of her background, but I see the difference that her approach makes in the debate and in the way councillors think about things, even in small ways. And so, to the extent that we have opportunities to build relationships with our local leaders and encourage them, I think that's a good thing. But as Paul pointed out, not all local councillors are supportive of some of these issues around homelessness, about the location of shelters or these projects. And there may be times when we are in opposition to our local politicians. What is it that we can do to, even in that opposition, try and draw them out into something more positive? I think it's important in all of this to acknowledge community fears and support ways to address them where possible. I really liked, Stephen, what you talked about in terms of the things that the shelter did to respond to some of what I think are legitimate concerns of the community. and going around and making sure that there were no used needles around as one example. So how can we come alongside and be that presence with people in our community that we may not agree with? I think another thing is to provide different ways for members of the congregation to engage in these kinds of projects. Not everyone may feel comfortable being up front at a public meeting. There may be practical ways that people can contribute to the development of welcome baskets or meals or other sorts of things. And encouraging people to also come up with their own ideas on how they or our churches can be involved. And then I think the other thing that you see and hear in all of our presentations this morning is about the importance of the relationships with other churches in the community. I think that's a really important thing, and both within our denominations and across denominations, as ways for us to build unity. In part, it's also just the reality of the demands of some of these issues that we're trying to address. An individual congregation on its own may not be able to do everything, but to try to do things together with other congregations is a real way to build broader unity and shared, I guess, a shared passion for having a positive impact in the communities around us. So